Cheer up, Henry. It wasn't your fault. Ice and snow caused the accident. I'm sending you to Crew, a fine place for sick engines. They'll give you a new shape and a larger firebox. You'll feel a different engine and won't need special coal anymore. Won't that be nice?
It had been 50 years to the day since Henry's infamous Flying Kipper crash of 1935. The island of Sodor was enduring one of its harshest winters in many years. Snow blanketed the island, wreaking havoc on the North Western Railway. All manner of misfortunes had befell the railway. The Peel-Godred branch's fleet of electric locomotives had been shut away in their shed. The skin-piercing chills of the season had frozen the overhead wires they picked up electricity from. As a result, the Fat Controller had to reassign engines to the branch in order to keep it running. On the morning of the 24th of January, 1985, the Fat Controller arrived at Tidmouth Sheds to give the engines their instructions for the day.
Good morning, engines. As you're all aware by now, the winter has caused many delays across the island, and nowhere more so than the Peel-Godred branch. I've been trying to consistently rotate the engines allocated to the branch with the overhead wires frozen solid, and today, I'll need Henry and James there.
The two engines stared at each other for a moment. Henry was about to say something when James cut him off. "Oh, but sir, surely we're too heavy for that line." The Fat Controller laughed.
You're so wrong, James. The Peel-Godred electric engines are actually some of the heaviest on the entire railway, and so the track can handle any engine.
Once again Henry was going to speak, but James butted in. "But sir, it's dirty work by a dirty power plant. It would ruin my paintwork."
On the contrary, James, the power station is hydroelectric, meaning it creates energy through the movement of water.
Now Henry, finally with an opportunity to speak, thought it best to do so before the Red Mogul kicked up another fuss. "If you are quite finished, James, we are more than happy to do so, sir." "Speak for yourself." The two engines left the sheds for Kildane to go up the Peel-Godred branch. The wires above their smoke boxes had become rigid. Icicles dangled from them like daggers, glinting in the morning light. It wasn't long before they reached Peel-Godred, where the yard foreman was waiting for them. "Ah, good, you're here. The work for you two will be split with one of you on goods trains and the other on the passenger trains. Sir Topham Hatt has recommended that—" "I'll do the passenger work, sir," James hastily interjected. The yard foreman gave him a stale look before continuing. "Yes, that's what he said. Henry, I presume you're all right with that?" "Yes, sir. You can count on us." The yard foreman nodded to the two before walking hastily back to his office. The chimney on the building began to pour out smoke, indicating he had just put a great deal of fuel into his fireplace. Not that anyone could blame him in these chilling conditions. The smoke billowed all over James. "Brilliant. So much for not getting dirty." Throughout the day, Henry and James worked hard, performing their respective duties to the best of their abilities, even in the unpredictable and treacherous conditions they faced. By the time the sun had set, James had already disappeared down the branch for the last time as he headed for home. Henry remained behind, shunting his final train to Knapford Harbour into position. With everything fastened and a green light from his guard, he blasted out from the aluminium works. Each blast from his exhaust was engulfed in a dance of orange and yellow from his firebox as his firemen piled coal in for the long trip ahead. He got the heavy train moving up to a sensible speed, though as he went he felt unsure, unsettled perhaps, as if he were being watched. He joined the main line and pulled into the yards at Kildane. There is no direct way to reach the east of Sodor without turning around when coming from the Peel-Godred branch, so Henry had to run around his train and carry on tender first, given there was no turntable. When running tender first, engines are forbidden from exceeding 45 miles per hour, and so Henry proceeded down the main line very gingerly indeed, especially given the icy rails. As he and his train clattered through Marin, he began to build up momentum for the gruelling climb ahead. A nearby bell rang for 11 as he did, ringing out ominously in the distance. The blast of his exhaust got louder and louder as he went, shifting from simple barks to tumultuous explosions like the roars of cannon fire as they echoed around the surrounding embankments. He lumbered over the top triumphantly and began to put his brakes on for the journey down the other side towards Wellsworth when it happened. The valve linking Henry's steam brake and vacuum brake had jammed, his wheels locked up and he skidded helplessly down Gordon's Hill, picking up speed rapidly. The big green engine began to panic as he screeched through Wellsworth, now a powerless runaway. He continued to careen through Crosby, slowly losing his momentum, but it wouldn't matter. As he neared his forest, his driver saw it.
Oh, glory!
A set of points had jammed themselves, setting the road for a loop and a sharp bend. It was small wonder as to what happened next. The next morning, the engines at Tidmouth Sheds awoke to find that Henry was missing, and quickly the drowsy morning greetings had turned into hubbubs and theories. Most bemused of all was James.
He should have been back not long after me. He was marshalling his last goods train when I left.
Bear, who had spent the night at Tidmouth after a set of points left him stuck in a siding by the station, tried to spread a more positive light on the situation.
Don't worry, James. He might have been very tired after finishing up his last train for the night. He might have spent the night at Knapford Sheds instead. You probably see him.
About that.
The engines all jumped. None of them had seen the fat controller walk up, bundled up like an Arctic explorer.
I need an engine to pick up the breakdown train and rescue Henry. I've received word that he has crashed in the forest just east of Crosby.
I'll go, sir.
Thank you, Bear.
The Hymex engine roared into life as he exited the sheds to go and rescue his stricken colleague. When he arrived there, he found the train in a heap, blocking most of the tracks in and out of the forest. Henry hadn't suffered too much, neither had his crew, as his tender had taken the brunt of the impact. His water tank had been pierced by debris though, and had created a frozen puddle around the big engine. His train had flung itself across the mainline in a zigzag, loads of aluminium flung from their wagons like waves of metal across a snowy ocean. Bear quickly set to work, lifting Henry from where he laid and getting his crew into the works coach to be checked over and taken to a hospital. Throughout the whole operation, Bear had tried to engage in conversation with Henry and get his account on the ordeal. Not a single word was uttered by the NWR's number 3, however. He sat in silence, an expression that cannot be described in one mere word across his face. Once as much had been recovered as possible, Bear set down the line. There was a deafening silence despite the roars from his hydraulics as no one said a word. The Hymek had decided any more efforts of getting through to Henry would be futile, and he would talk about it when and if he was ready. Days went by and the engines checked in on Henry when and if they could. The repairs to his tender were extensive, but rapid progress was being made. Around a week after the accident, Bear was shunted into the works next to Henry by the works diesel. The linkage between his transmission and engine had failed and needed repairing as soon as possible. He was pleased to see that Henry was awake and hoped to find answers.
Good morning, Henry. How are you doing?
Bear? I didn't expect to see you. What happened?
An issue with the linkage between my transmission and engine. Hopefully a quick fix. But enough about me. We're all really worried about you. What happened the other day?
Henry's face fell upon a blank expression for a moment. That phrase seemed like it had triggered something within the big green engine, though he tried not to show it. He looked at his buffers, then out to the yards before his eyes rested upon Bear again.
How much do you know about my crash with the Flying Kipper in 1935?
Bear was taken aback by this question. It seemed irrelevant to the current subject, but he didn't want to risk upsetting his colleague.
Ice and snow jammed a signal when you crashed into the back of James's goods train. You were sent off to Crewe for a rebuild.
And what about any fatalities?
Bear was even more confused and surprised by this question. He couldn't quite decipher what Henry was getting at.
guard of the goods train you hit was killed. A collision between you and a brake van at about 50 miles an hour, it would have obliterated it.
There was one more.
Bear gave Henry a solemn, yet sympathetic look.
I'm so sorry, Henry. I'd hate to think you still carry these tragedies on your conscience.
At the mention of the word tragedy, Henry's face snapped into a scowl, as if a sleeper agent within him had just awoken.
The guard's death was a tragedy, but not the other person involved. He had it coming, and yet he still skulks around, making my life miserable.
Bear was baffled by this outburst. The way Henry had said it had sounded almost sadistic.
Whoa, Henry, steady. Whoa, wait, what do you say by still?
The anger in Henry's eyes quickly subsided, and it was replaced with a display of remorse. His demeanour once again flipped, like faces on a coin. It was at this moment a voice could be heard as Bear's engine roared into life.
You're all set, Bear.
I'll leave the works tonight. If Edward is at the sheds, ask him about the name Adrian Knight. He'll be able to provide the full context.
Bear didn't say anything, still slightly shaken by Henry's previous outburst, but he gave him a smile as he left the works. He hadn't been there as long as he hoped, nor had he got the answers he wanted. In fact, he had even more questions. Night fell, and sure enough, as Henry had said, Edward was indeed at Tidmouth Sheds when he arrived, as was Henry himself. Bear rolled in between the two of them.
Edward, I have something to ask you.
Certainly, Bear. What's on your mind?
Well, this was spurred on by a chat me and Henry had.
He paused to see Henry giving him a knowing stare. Bear returned this look before continuing.
What do you know about Adrian Knight?
At the mention of this name, Edward's eyes widened for a moment. He looked at Henry, who seemed to motion for the old engine to speak.
Adrian Knight. Now that is a name I haven't heard in a long time. He was a signalman back in the late 1920s and into the 1930s too. He was productive and efficient, but he was also a little bit of a troublemaker. It got to a point where our controller at the time, Sir Topham Hatt I, had completely lost patience with his actions and sacked him in November of 1934. Days before, he had led a strike of signalmen that left someone untrained in a signal box and caused an accident, so sacking him was justified. After this, well, he became deranged and angered. He actively slandered the railway and Sir Topham Hatt at our own stations and was banned from railway property. After that, he seemed to vanish over the Christmas period. He wasn't seen again. Well, at least until...
Edward paused. He looked at Henry, who had remained surprisingly silent.
Wanna take over from here, Henry?
Henry looked away meekly. He did seem as though he was going to say something, but hesitated. There was a deafening silence between the engines in the sheds, all of whom listened intently.
I suppose I will. January of 1935 was one of the harshest months we've had in a long time. The temperatures were almost at record lows for the century. These conditions had plagued the railway greatly. Though in the very early hours of the 24th of January, when Henry set out to take the Flying Kipper, the weather was not to blame when he crashed. Adrian Knight had trespassed and jammed a signal and a set of points into a siding where James had stopped with a goods train. Unfortunately for him, however, he caught his leg on the point blade and was stuck. He desperately tried to get it out, though it was being crushed by the huge blade. His panic grew when he heard a train approaching through.
The engines were all baffled by what they had heard. Henry was always right to be defensive about a crash so severe that killed a guard, but now they really understood why he tried to deflect the subject so quickly. "There is more to it, though," Henry said in a morbid tone. "Whilst I was laid up at crew, I sat alone in the workshops most nights, and on one of those occasions he came back. He appeared in front of me, staring at me coldly with eyes that could pierce a stone wall. He walked around me, then stood in front of me again, before walking towards me and vanishing. I'm convinced my recent accident was his doing too. I killed him, and he has had it out for me ever since." All of the engines remained silent in various states of mind, except for James.
I remember Adrian Knight very well. However, I'm sure he's not out there. It was very compelling until the ghost part.
Believe what you will, James, but you should know better than to mock the supernatural.
Edward is right, James. As I said, I saw him all those years ago, and it hasn't left me. I can still see that look in those soulless eyes of his.
James said no more. Edward, Henry and Bear all said their goodnights too, and all went to sleep, though none had an easy time falling asleep that night. Throughout the next day, James was back on the Pilgoddard branch, this time paired up with Bear. He was absolutely livid to find that he was rostered on the goods trains, but got on with his work through gritted teeth and smarmy comments. Around 10 PM, he sat waiting in the departure siding at the aluminium works, with a rake of empty wagons, waiting to take them back to Kildane before returning home light engine when the yard foreman came to speak to him. "Good evening, James. I'd like to thank you first for your hard work over these last couple of days." "Thank you, sir. However, there has been a points failure up the line and you can't leave yet."
Oh, come on! It's freezing out here!
"I'm sorry, James. There's nought I can do about it." The yard foreman turned on his heel and made a beeline for his car, desperate to get back to his warm home and leaving James to wait it out. About 2 hours later, James had fallen asleep. His crew had gone off to the office to stay warm when he awoke with a start. The temperature felt like it had been halved since he fell asleep, his boiler tubes like icicles now. This made him incredibly apprehensive as he looked around, taking in his snowy surroundings before looking down and almost jumping out of his boiler cladding. There in front of him was a man. James felt as if his eyes had pierced his smoke box, almost gazing right through the startled red engine, as if he wasn't there. He walked closer to James, eyeing him up and down as if he had never seen him before. He then stepped back. James wanted to speak, but he couldn't. He felt his entire face stiffen as the man opened his mouth.
"Your railway ruined my life."
His voice felt like it could carry itself across the entire island as a gust of wind conveyed the man's icy words. He stared at James for a few moments with the same unfleeting gaze that words could simply not describe, before disappearing. The whole ordeal lasted no more than a minute, but to James it was a lifetime. As if on cue, the temperature seemed to climb back to a normal level and his crew came out of the office. "You're right, James. Time to go." James didn't say a word for the entire journey down the branch. He dropped off the wagons at Kildane and headed for home tender first like Henry had some days before. James was different from then on. He always seemed to be looking over his figurative shoulder, almost always in fear and especially at night. He didn't mention what had happened to him that night, but Henry, Edward, and even Bear all knew. And most importantly, he never again mocked the supernatural, in fear he would get another visit from the Signalman.
Whew. Adrian Knight. Now that is a name I haven't heard in a long time. A long time. I'm Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm Obi-Wan Kenedward. Sorry. Back to the lines.